Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hewitt Shaw, the president of the City Club's Board of Directors, and I'm honored to welcome to this special forum this afternoon the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States of America, Jack Lew. Secretary Lew was confirmed by the Senate and took office as our country's 76th Secretary of the Treasury in February of this year, succeeding Tim Geithner. Before becoming Treasury Secretary, Secretary Lew served as President Obama's White House Chief of Staff, and prior to that as the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, serving in that role also during the Clinton administration. He also served the current administration as Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources. We are all too well aware of the economic challenges that faced the Obama administration as it took office following 2008. As budgetary and fiscal policy developed during the early years of President Obama's administration, to confront that crisis, Secretary Lew, then as the OMB director, was at the center of the budget negotiations with Congress during the summer of 2011 and the build-up to and the immediate aftermath of the so-called fiscal cliff negotiations at the end of 2012. His role as chief policy architect for the Obama administration continues, of course, with his role now as Secretary of the Treasury, addressing issues ranging from domestic tax, budgetary, and entitlement program policies to international financial issues. In addition to his public service, Secretary Lew has significant experience in the public sector, practicing as an attorney, serving as an administrator at a large university, and as an executive at a large financial firm. After introductory remarks from Secretary Lew, he will be joined by Dan Moulthrop, our recently named new CEO of the City Club. Dan is a graduate of the University of California, an award-winning journalist, and most recently a co-founder of the Civic Commons. We're delighted to have Dan with us today. And with that, I'll ask Secretary Lew to join us on the podium and to give us his introductory remarks. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to Hewitt Shaw for that kind introduction, and thank you, Dan Moulthrop, for joining on the stage for the program today, and thank you to all of you for being here today. It's great to be here at the City Club, and it's great to be here in Cleveland. Started the day at a middle school where I got the chance to meet with students to discuss the importance of science, technology, engineering, and math. I had a roundtable discussion with business leaders, many of you in the room today, at Nortec, and I visited Vitamix, an innovative family-owned business that's manufacturing state-of-the-art products for export around the world. Now, I'd like to spend a few moments this afternoon speaking about our economy and about creating jobs. I'd also like to leave as much time as we can for answering your questions. So let me start with a few observations. Our economy is much stronger today than it was 4 years ago, but we must continue to take action to help speed up growth and put more people to work. Just over 4 years ago, when President Obama first took office, economic conditions were the worst our nation has seen since the Great Depression. Our economy was contracting at a 5.3% annual rate. More than 700,000 jobs were disappearing every month. Homes were being foreclosed, businesses were shuttering their doors, savings accounts were decimated, and the auto industry, a cornerstone of Ohio's economy, was unraveling. The President moved quickly to respond to the financial crisis, to reignite economic growth, and to revive auto manufacturing. And thanks to the President's decisive and quick actions, along with steps taken by the previous administration, the Congress, and the Federal Reserve, our economy is growing, and there are signs of steady improvement. Since 2009, the economy has expanded for 15 consecutive quarters. Private employers have added 6.8 million jobs over the past 38 months, and since job growth resumed, manufacturing has registered the strongest period of job growth since 1986. The housing market has been improving for more than a year, posting clear gains in construction, sales, and prices. Our financial system is stronger with far more effective oversight than before the crisis. Families continue to repair their balance sheets, with household debt as a share of personal income falling to a 10-year low in late 2012. Consumer spending and business investment growth have been solid. And we've made substantial progress reducing our federal budget deficit in a balanced way. Yet a lot of work remains. Families are still struggling. Unemployment remains too high. Growth is not as fast as we would like. There's still more to do to put our fiscal house in order, and we continue to confront risks to our economy and national security by applying sanctions against outlaw regimes and working with the business community to guard against cyber threats. Nevertheless, as we face all these challenges, our top priority as a nation has to be growing the economy and creating good jobs in the United States. It's important to note that this recovery is being led by the private sector. Our businesses and entrepreneurs are doing what they do best. They're expanding, innovating, and hiring. And because of their determination, our economy is poised to shift into a higher gear. But there are dangers ahead, and one of the most significant speed bumps for growth is coming straight from Washington, where some political leaders continue to generate one manufactured crisis after the next. These standoffs and short-sighted maneuvers are a drag on our economy, and they undermine confidence, which is a key driver of economic activity. 2 months ago, we saw another one of these manufactured crises come to the surface when Congress let a series of harsh, indiscriminate spending cuts known as sequestration go into effect. Nearly every part of the federal government is coping with an onslaught of these sudden, reckless, across-the-board cuts, and its impact is being felt in communities across the country. In Ohio, these cuts translate into roughly 2,500 kids getting kicked out of Head Start and early Head Start programs. They translate into less college aid for over 3,000 low-income students, and they translate into a loss of more than $800,000 for programs like Meals on Wheels that provide food to our most vulnerable seniors. This is not good public policy, and it is certainly not good economic policy. These cuts will hamper growth and hinder job creation. In fact, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, sequestration will shave off more than 0.5% of economic growth this year and cost us as many as 750,000 full-time equivalent jobs at a time when our economy should be increasing our GDP and adding jobs. Everyone here got a window into how significant the collateral economic impact could be with the recent news that this year's Cleveland Air Show had to be canceled, costing the local economy millions in lost revenue. So it's high time we replace the sequester before it causes even more pain. Earlier this year, the President put forward his budget. In it, he replaced the sequestration with sensible deficit reduction measures that eliminate unnecessary programs and close wasteful special interest loopholes. It is important that Congress enact those measures as soon as possible. At the same time, the President's budget restores our nation's long-term fiscal health by finishing the job that was started early in this administration. You see, despite all the noise and rhetoric to the contrary, we've made considerable strides to pare down our deficit. Over the past 2 years, the President and Congress have come together to hammer out historic agreements that have dramatically reduced spending and raised revenue. And when you combine these changes with savings from interest, we've locked in more than $2.5 trillion deficit reduction over the next 10 years. More than 2/3 of that reduction has come from spending cuts. Let me say that again. The deficit reduction we have already achieved comes from $2 of spending cuts for every $1 of revenue. But we can do more to shrink the deficit over the next decade. The President's budget will lower the federal budget deficit by nearly $2 trillion more. That will bring the total deficit reduction to more than the original goal of $4 trillion, a level that independent economists believe is necessary to stabilize our finances. Our budget achieves these savings through a balanced mix of spending reductions, tax reform, and responsible changes to Medicare that will strengthen the program for future generations. What is particularly important about our approach to deficit reduction is that it would strengthen our recovery and lay a foundation for long-term economic growth. But as important as deficit reduction is, it cannot be our guiding star. Deficit reduction alone is not an economic policy. We have to apply the same sense of urgency to expanding our economy and getting people back to work. Let us not forget that we are still living with the scars caused by the financial crisis. For instance, one of the lasting repercussions of the crisis has been a high rate of long-term unemployment. We know that the longer experienced workers go without a job, the more likely they are to see their skills erode and their professional contacts fade away. This can lead to even longer periods of unemployment, and it can result in lower productivity and lower output for our economy. Similarly, joblessness among young people, which has come down from an all-time high in 2010, is still too high. For too many young people, long periods without work means they may never catch up with their peers in terms of earnings. This again is bad for our country's economic productivity and output and could lead to an economy that underperforms where growth and job creation are below their potential. But we do not have to settle for weaker growth and fewer jobs. We do not have to set our sights lower or sit back and watch our global competitiveness wither and our middle class grow smaller. Not when both parties in Washington can come together to secure a better economic future. The point is, there's a path ahead that will allow us to both shrink our deficits and fuel opportunities for workers and businesses. The President will talk about this path forward when he travels to Texas later this week. What he'll emphasize, as he did in the State of the Union address, is that if we want to increase prosperity today and the prospects for long-term growth, we have to strengthen the middle class. And the way to strengthen the middle class is to zero in on three central things: bringing more jobs to our shores, giving American workers the skills needed to do those jobs, and making sure that hard work amounts to a decent living. I'd like to highlight a few of the areas where we can make investments to strengthen the middle class. And it's important to remember that these investments are all paid for. In other words, they do not add a dime to the deficit. When I talk to business leaders, one of the first things they tell me is how important our infrastructure is to what they do. Businesses cannot operate effectively when roads, bridges, ports, and pipelines are crumbling. So we want to create what we call a fix-it-first program to get repairs started on things that have been long deferred, like the nearly 70,000 structurally deficient bridges across the country. This will put contractors and construction workers on the job as soon as possible, and we could start making these essential repairs right away. And to keep taxpayers from shouldering the entire burden of these upgrades, we would establish a program to attract private capital so that we can make the repairs that will deliver long-term benefits for our businesses and our economy. Our strategy to accelerate the pace of economic growth and job creation also includes strengthening the manufacturing sector. Our businesses make some of the best designed and best built products in the world. Our manufacturing workers are second to none. But we need to take steps so that we're making more things here that the world wants to buy. The importance of manufacturing is well understood in Ohio, where manufacturing is the largest sector of the economy. Earlier today, I visited Vitamix, where high-skilled workers are putting together high-tech products for export to more than 100 countries, including China, Britain, and Germany. Innovating, designing, building, and exporting goods around the world. That is what we mean when we talk about advanced manufacturing, and it's the kind of thing Ohio is known for and America is known for. We just need to do more of it in more places. To expand our country's manufacturing base, we will make our tax code more competitive. Right now, companies get tax breaks for moving jobs and operations overseas. That needs to change. Our approach would put an end to these unwarranted tax breaks and start rewarding companies that open up operations and generate jobs in the United States. At the same time, we're calling on Congress to make the research and experimentation tax credit permanent. This tax credit propels private investment in research and technology, and it helps unleash innovation in our country that lead to future industries, future jobs, and future breakthroughs in production and engineering. The power of this tax credit is clear, and we want to finally make it permanent so companies can plan with confidence for future investments. We also want to jumpstart more centers of high-tech manufacturing. These innovation hubs bring businesses, colleges, and agencies like the Department of Defense together to focus on world-leading manufacturing technologies. Last year, we started our first Manufacturing Innovation Institute not far from here in Youngstown, Ohio. That area was hard hit when companies started moving production overseas. And today, a defunct warehouse is now an advanced lab where workers are mastering 3D printing technology. So we've seen the potential of these manufacturing centers, and our plan would set up 15 more hubs around the country. As important as it is for our businesses to generate the jobs of tomorrow, it's equally as important for our workers to have the necessary skills to get those jobs and perform at those jobs. That's why we want to introduce incentives for high schools to create classes that focus on science, technology, engineering, and math. We also want to reward schools that work with colleges and businesses to design programs that prepare students to enter the workforce. And since we know retraining programs can be instrumental in getting unemployed workers back on the job, we want to encourage local community colleges to tailor skill-building programs to the needs of local companies. Infrastructure, manufacturing, worker training, These are all part of our blueprint to step up growth and get more Americans back to work. But that's not all. We also must continue to take advantage of our domestic energy sources safely and responsibly. As we've seen with the shale boom here in Ohio, we've been steadily increasing domestic energy production over the last few years. Today, the United States is less dependent on foreign oil than any time in nearly 2 decades. We're producing more oil at home than we have in 10 years, and we're producing more natural gas than any time in history. The President has been clear that he wants to continue this trend and build on the progress we've made in recent years. And the administration is taking steps to continue to streamline permitting while also ensuring that industry relies on best practices to make sure that expanded production goes hand in hand with safety. At the same time, energy from renewable sources like wind and solar doubled in the President's first term, and we will continue to invest in these important technologies. By taking these measures, we will help develop more industries here at home and lower energy costs for households and businesses while creating good-paying jobs. So those are some of the moves we can make to reinforce our economic strength now and well into the future. Our plan is full of common-sense ideas, but there is no easy solution here. The students I met with today who are studying science are still going to have to buckle down and make the most of their education. The business leaders I met with are still going to have to innovate and figure out new ways to beat the competition. And the employees I met with at Vitamix are still going to have to work hard every day and take care of their families. Now, I know everyone here has faith that those students, business leaders, and workers are going to do the things that they have to do. That's because, to put it simply, this is how our country works. Our people are strong, our businesses are tough, and our economy is resilient. In recent times, we've been tested by recession and drought, terrorism and financial turmoil. Yet time and again, we have not just survived, we've prospered. And we will continue to prosper because we will continue to confront the challenges that come at us. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. So we're going to talk up here for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll be bringing in questions from all of you. I want to start with something that began earlier, well, I guess about a month ago or so, that you referenced a little bit, the new budget, the budget proposal, I guess we should call it. You, and last week, I think you met with members of the House and prepared them, gave them a little bit of a preview for a tax code overhaul. And you referenced this a little bit in your remarks. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit, because I know a lot of people would like to know, I mean, basically, how much am I going to pay next year?
Well, the President for several years now has been calling for tax reform. Now, tax reform overall, individual tax reform and business tax reform, is going to have to come as part of an overall fiscal package where we finish the job of the $4 trillion of deficit reduction I was talking about in my opening remarks. We're most of the way there. We don't need to raise enormous amounts of revenue. We need to raise almost $600 billion of revenue in the process over 10 years in order to finish the job of $4 trillion of deficit reduction. Mm-hmm. So that would leave us at $2 of spending cuts for $1 of revenue. In the context of tax reform, we had multiple goals. The cross-cutting goal is to make the economy work better. And the complexity of the tax code is something that's a burden to individuals and businesses. It is a costly process to comply with. And it is probably frustrating when someone's trying to start a business to figure out how do they even qualify for the kinds of tax advantages that might actually be helpful to them. So on both the individual and the business side, the key is going to be how much can we do to broaden the base. That means eliminating deductions and loopholes or trimming back on deductions and loopholes. Let me talk for a minute about business tax reform. Business tax reform is important for a number of reasons. One, when you look at our statutory tax rate, we are at the high end of the world. When you look at our effective tax rate, we're in a cluster of other countries. If we were to broaden the base and reduce our statutory tax rate to a level of around 28%, we would make it more competitive for businesses that want to do business in the United States to have their headquarters here and to pay their taxes here.
What you're talking about, I mean, we heard a lot about this during the campaign. It seems like something that Republicans and Democrats agree on. And yet somehow I think that when it comes down to it, Republicans and Democrats won't agree on it.
Look, the hard part for both Republicans and Democrats is this broadening the base sounds great when you're talking about it at 20,000 feet.
And when you're talking about somebody else paying more.
When you're talking about each of the individual loopholes that has to be closed, for everyone who's affected by that, it's a big deal.
Because
and
people
that's
they've built businesses depending on a loophole.
Well, you know, whether they've built their businesses on it or looking ahead,
or their business
they don't
model.
want to lose it. The truth is, if we were to lower the statutory rate, that benefit would go to all on an equal basis. The special provisions, for the most part, are addressing priorities of another generation. So we're having a boom in oil and gas in the United States today. We would have a boom in oil and gas even if some of the special tax provisions were trimmed back. It's not
the
something...
oil and gas industry is a large, large industry.
Yes, it is.
And you've dealt with them as much as anybody. Are they likely to say, oh, yeah, you can get rid of those loopholes? Because here in Ohio, when Republican Governor John Kasich has said, I would like to raise the severance tax on gas and oil that's extracted through fracking, the oil and gas industry has said, well, that's going to push us to another state.
Well, you know, you can't push the oil and gas reserves to another state. The oil and gas reserves
This is true.
are fixed. National policy has the benefit of not having opening the door to beggar thy neighbor policy from state to state. And one of the kind of fundamental truths of natural resource is that it is one of the few things that's uniquely located where it is. So I actually don't think on a national basis we would see a problem on that front. I don't disagree with the proposition, though, that there will be resistance to it. That could be said about every provision that broadens the base, which is why it can't be something that Republicans do against Democratic opposition or the Democrats do against Republican opposition. Base broadening can only happen if it's done together, because you have to stand shoulder to shoulder and say we're going to put the common good over all of these individual interests, which are difficult interests to say no to. I think it's possible, but it's hard. So on the issue where I'd say there's the most consensus, broadening the base and lowering the tax rate, we shouldn't for a minute consider it to be easy. Now, if we could have a framework of a fiscal agreement and get to work on doing the details, the country would be better off. I actually think the economy would do a lot better if we ended the debate and did what we're going to do, and the uncertainty of where is this going to go was resolved. And I think the lower rate would actually make our industries more competitive.
How did Republicans on the Ways and Means Committee respond to your preview?
Well, look, the core issue that we and they do not agree on is this question of what the composition of a fiscal frame should be. They think that it should all the remaining deficit reduction should be spending cuts. We think it should be balanced, and that overall there should be the proper balance between spending and revenue, which we think roughly a 2-to-1 ratio is right. You know, these things are never such precise science, so we haven't locked it in to the last decimal place. But you know, we're not going to go to 10-to-1, and we're and we're not asking them to. But you know, we're not going to move. And we're not asking them to go to
parity.
The opposite.
Right.
I think that if you look at where the negotiations between the president and the speaker were last December, we were very close. You know, in a normal negotiating environment, we were 1 or 2 conversations away from a deal that would have actually put this behind us.
But at the time it appeared, and in retrospect it appeared too, that the speaker didn't actually have his team with him.
You know, I can't speak to the politics
I'm sure you can't.
on the other side. I do know that in order to solve this problem in a fair way, in a way that will have lasting and positive impact on the economy, it would be good if we could get together and finish this. You know, the president put in his budget some things that are very hard for a Democratic president to have put forward. When we got into discussions over the last 3 years, with Republican leaders. They said there were 3 things that we needed to do in order for revenues to be on the table. 2 of them are in the budget. One is something called the chain CPI, updating the way the CPI, which is used for adjusting Social Security benefits, is calculated. And we put that in the budget, even though it would have the effect of reducing benefits by a small
the Consumer Price Index.
The Consumer Price Index. Second was means testing Medicare. We put in our budget a proposal that would have what we call an income-related premium, which essentially means above a certain income, you pay for your Medicare benefit. You don't get a subsidy. In any kind of negotiation I've been in, when there are 3 things that are essential and the other party puts 2 of them on the table, that's considered a good faith effort to find a sensible middle ground. We're asking them to move into that sensible center.
What was number 3?
Number 3 was changing the retirement age of Medicare. And frankly, we just don't think that that's a good idea. As we thought about it a lot over the last 3 years, it would have the effect of increasing national health care spending. Because when you move people from Medicare to private insurance, they're going from a less expensive to a more expensive form of coverage. So it doesn't accomplish anything in terms of reducing national health care spending. It just shifts a cost. And it shifts a cost at a fairly vulnerable point in life. If you're 65 years old and working and not getting employer-provided health insurance, that's probably not the ideal point in life to have a $5,000 or $10,000 a year expense.
Is that something you think that eventually needs to happen?
I think that there do need to be savings in Medicare, and we have in our budget a number of structural proposals and would be open to discussions of other things that would strengthen Medicare. I think it's something that the strongest argument for it is that it kind of notionally resets the normal retirement age so that Social Security and Medicare would both be at the kind of 68 being the normal retirement age. The difference is that on Social Security, if you retire at 65, you get a benefit that's just reduced a little bit. In Medicare, it's an on-off switch. And there may be ways of fixing it to make it less of a burden on that group, but I've yet to see something that fully addresses the problem. So it's not that we say it's not something we would think about or look at. We look very hard at it. There was a point when the president, in order to try to reach an agreement in 2011, was prepared to do it. But in the years between 2011 and now, we've actually done a fair amount of analysis. There are better ways to save money in Medicare.
You mentioned sequestration. And firstly, as a former English teacher, I want to thank you for using it as a noun, in the noun form, rather than the sequester, which has always troubled me. But you're also credited with being one of the brains behind it. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
And I know, and let me say this too. We all know what it was intended to do. What I'm interested in is also hearing your thoughts on why you think it didn't do what you thought it would do.
So why don't I go back a little bit to, actually go back to 1984.
Right, because it was the 85. The 85 was the first time we saw this.
The idea of sequestration grew out of a budget debate in mid-1980s where Senators Phil Gramm and Warren Rudman put this proposal out there saying if you don't hit deficit targets, these automatic across-the-board cuts would take effect, and they named them sequestration. Now, I will tell you that in the 1980s, I strongly opposed the idea. I thought it was a very bad idea. And it ultimately was something we negotiated, and I was part of negotiating then to make it work as well as a bad idea could work, but I never thought it was a good idea. In 1990...
In 85, did it actually have the desired effect?
Well, I'm good. 1990 is when it
1990,
had
okay.
In 1990, when I was not in government at the time, but it was the first Bush administration, reached an agreement with Congress to do very important deficit reduction. That agreement was reached to avoid sequestration. So while it was not something I thought was a good idea in the mid-1980s, it did have the effect in 1990 of being the impetus for parties to come together and reach a balanced agreement with revenues and spending cuts and painful policy to avoid what was considered this awful outcome. So now roll the clock forward to 2011. In August 2011, every idea to solve the problem had been exhausted. To refresh your memory,
Please.
the stakes were very high. We had Congress, the Republicans in Congress, saying, we will not extend the debt limit. We will cause the United States to default unless you accede to our demands. So it was not a form of negotiation that was particularly admirable, but the consequences were very stark. We tried all kinds of mixes of taxes and spending and different mixes of spending with defense and non-defense, and nothing was, we couldn't reach agreement on any other mix. And we were at the 11th hour, and the last idea that there was some chance of reaching agreement on was to create a process where Congress would have some more time to deal with it. But the demand was, at the end of that process, something really bad has to happen in order to make sure the process works. Well, I couldn't think of anything worse than sequestration, and I will concede that I was in the group that designed something, the purpose of which was to be so bad that nobody would ever let it happen.
Was it not bad enough?
And, you know, you have to ask why it actually is more severe than the cuts that would have taken effect in 1990. In 1990, it was considered so bad that the parties came together. This year,
those were more rational times.
well, there are different people in office now. I think that if you look at the composition of sequestration, the idea that was its virtue was that it was equally obnoxious to everyone. That if you cared mostly about defense spending, $50 billion of defense spending cuts in 1 year would be unthinkable. If you cared about human resource programs, cuts to Head Start and the things like health research would be unacceptable. I think one of the things that is surprising to me, you know, at this moment, is that there are people who are actually pointing to sequestration and declaring victory that, as if it's something that they accomplished. A policy that was deliberately designed to be bad policy is in fact bad policy. And over time it will settle in as being the bad policy it was designed to be. What I don't think has happened this time that did happen the last time is our elected officials in Congress are not thinking about what effects are going to happen in 3 months, 6 months, or down the road. You saw with the FAA, when something hit close to home, when it was an inconvenience to them and to the people that they spend their weekends with, and when it became something that became a subject of national focus, in 3 days they took action to deal with it.
It was surprising. I mean, I did not know that Congress could move that fast.
You know, you call me old-fashioned, but I think as members go home over the coming months and they meet with small businesses that have closed down because they're defense subcontractors who've been cut off, as they meet with parents whose kids can't go to Head Start, as they meet with people who are suffering from diseases but they can't get into facilities that would have treated them, I think this is going to start to build up. And it's not as if we're saying don't make other decisions. We're saying make sensible decisions, make balanced policy decisions. So I remain optimistic that there will be a resolution of this, but I will admit that I underestimated the change in the political landscape, such that the defense cuts that we're describing are not considered troubling to many Republicans now. You know, I would have. I think that there is a large part of the Republican Party that's very upset about it. I think it's one of the reasons you see senators like John McCain and Lindsey Graham and congressmen like Buck McKeon saying there ought to be an alternative to sequestration. But there are other voices that are standing up saying, no, defense is no different than domestic spending. I think it's going to take longer for it to settle in. I think the effects are real, and the effects are damaging. The part that it's hard for the political process to fully grasp in its decision-making process is the macroeconomic effect. These individual effects, I think, will have an impact. I believe the macroeconomic effect should be a more serious subject of debate in the Congress right now. To take 0.5 to 0.75% out of GDP and 750,000 jobs out of the economy at a time when we're trying and succeeding in recovering from the deepest recession since the Great Depression, if you could propose policy that would have the effect
of growing the economy by 0.5%, people would run to a policy to do that. And here, all you have to do is eliminate the bad policy that you didn't mean to take effect. The problem is you have to cross that Rubicon and be willing to go to that sensible center and reach a balanced agreement. The president, I know, is prepared to do that. He's made that clear in his budget. He's made it clear by his actions. I hope we have the ability to get that done.
I want to turn our attention to the world and the role that the U.S. plays in the world, the role that you play as a representative of the U.S. in the world. In the coming days, you're heading to the G7 summit, and there will be a lot of headlines about this, and most of it will be incomprehensible to most of us. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about, you know, if we're watching this happen, what should we pay attention to? What actually matters to the Midwest and to Ohio in terms of what you're about to do with your counterparts around the world?
There's a very fundamental conversation in meetings like the G7 about how to get the right balance between growth and austerity or fiscal consolidation. I think there's broad agreement that, as in the United States, in Europe, there needs to be a medium and long-term program to get fiscal affairs in order. We can't run deficits that just grow beyond anyone's comfort zone in terms of the size of the deficit or the debt as a percentage of GDP. Where we don't have complete agreement and where these conversations are very important is the timing, how important it is to do it right away. You know, we took a different path in Europe. We put in place deficit reduction over a longer period of time, and we got our economy moving by increasing the deficit in the short term. Now, I don't think you can cut your way out of deficits or cut your way to prosperity. You have to grow your way there. And you can't grow your way there if fiscal policy is just pushing the economy down when it's needing to recover. Now, our European friends have taken a different view. They've both, many of them in their own countries and collectively through the EU, had much tougher short-term policies. So I think part of it is getting that balance right in terms of short and long term. You know,
But
fear
as a part of this is that manufacturing jobs here depend on exports that are being purchased there, and if their economies aren't growing at the rate that we think they should, then
Absolutely.
That's what I mean. That's
So why do we care is a separate issue. Why do we care in the United States, and why do we care here in Cleveland? Now, we should care because it's better for the world if economies are growing than shrinking, and it's a more peaceful, safe world. But if you're manufacturing something like at the Vitamix factory I was at today, and you're selling to Europe, and Europe is in recession, your sales are going to go down. Europe is our largest export market. So if Europe is shrinking, it's very hard for us to grow our sales or even maintain our sales. You know, I was just in China a few weeks ago, and you know, China is continuing to grow, but its growth has slowed down. If China grows by plus or minus 1%, it makes a huge difference in terms of markets that are open for American businesses. The more markets that are open to us, the more jobs we create at home. So it's core to our fundamental goal of growing the economy here in the United States and creating jobs that we work on the international stage to try and promote policies that will lead to the kind of growth that can benefit us here as well. You know, in past recoveries, the United States has been the engine pulling the rest of the world up. And I think the rest of the world has to realize that as we become a highly developed economy, we can't play the same role that we did in past recoveries. So that's where, you know, China comes in, and we can't be growing while Europe is shrinking and kind of grow fast enough to make up for their shrinkage.
You mentioned you used the phrase "put your fiscal house in order," and one of the questions that comes up about the Treasury Department and also about the roots of our recession has to do with the connections and the relationships between Treasury and big Wall Street banks and the too big to fail banks, the big six, say. And another piece of that question has to do with whether those responsible for the economic collapse of 2008 have actually been held accountable. Where do you come down on all of this?
Well, I think there are separate issues. In terms of the funds, public funds that went into helping stop the meltdown of our financial system.
The TARP program.
The TARP program. We've been working hard to recover those monies and have been doing very well.
So I think that, we are going to be just zealous about making sure that we protect taxpayers to get as much of that recovered as we possibly can, and we're doing very well. I think the response to the financial crisis of 2008 was not just the infusion of money through TARP. It was the passage of the Dodd-Frank bill, which was the most substantial rewrite of our financial regulatory laws in 2 generations. In the Great Depression, a lot of the laws that created the financial regulatory structure were created, and many of them were little changed until Dodd-Frank. So you went from the 1930s to 2008 when things started falling apart, and then people started taking a look. You can't wait that long. The financial system doesn't stand still for 2 generations. You have to have the ability to regulate and see what's going on. And Dodd-Frank created powerful tools to make sure that financial institutions would have more capital. If they have more capital, that means that if they have hard times, they can handle it themselves. They don't have to turn to the taxpayers. To put in new regulatory procedures so that regulators could see what's going on inside the banks. To put in limitations on leverage. There's a host of provisions, many of which are implemented, some of which are not. Resolution rules. What happens if a bank fails? The living wills that create a clear plan with the largest institution of how they can cover their own exposure and not have the taxpayer have to do it. So Dodd-Frank was created with the stated purpose of ending too big to fail. We're now at a point where several years later, we have to finish the implementation of it. Now, I will say that for the first year and a half of Dodd-Frank's life, it was not something that was broadly accepted as being permanent law, in the sense that the financial services industry and many on the Republican side were working for its repeal. And that manifested itself...
And preventing the head of the Consumer Protection Agency from actually beginning his job.
There is a fine Ohioan who deserves to be confirmed immediately,
Speaking of Richard Cordray, yes.
Who, it's actually interesting you raise him, because I've yet to meet anyone who criticizes either Richard Cordray the man or Richard Cordray's work. I mean, he's gotten very high marks on both sides of the aisle, but he hasn't been confirmed. It's a kind of resistance to letting the institutions created by Dodd-Frank function in a normal way. That's unacceptable. I mean, you pass a law, you create a position, you put a talented person up for confirmation, he does a good job. By any rules that I've ever seen, that person should be confirmed. Yet it's a struggle. The funding of agencies like the Commodities Future Trading Commission, which has a lot of these very complicated rules. When I was OMB director, per dollar, I had to put more time into working to get them the minimum money that they needed just to write the rules. And it delayed them because they didn't get the money in time. Now, I would say in the last 6 months, we're in a different environment. There is a broad acceptance that Dodd-Frank is the law. There's a desire to finish the work. As a new Treasury Secretary, I've already met 3 times with the coordinating body that's responsible for overseeing this. I have made clear that it is at the very top of my priority list to complete these regulations, to provide clarity to financial institutions. And then if we need to, you take a look afterwards. You can fix things if it's either too tight or not tight enough. What we can't do is put off completing the rules, and we have to get that done. And I have to tell you, we can't wait 2 generations before we take another look at it. We have to stay on this in real time and not wait till there's a crisis to say the tools that were created in Dodd-Frank are no longer adequate. So I don't think that we're at the moment in time where you've seen Dodd-Frank in its full implementation. I think we're more than halfway there. But by the end of this year, I certainly hope to be able to say, now we can take a look and see, have we done enough? Have we done too much?
We're going to move over to questions from the audience right now. And if you're just joining us online at our stream that's sponsored by the University of Akron, I'll say that you're listening to an address and a conversation with Treasury Secretary Jack Lew. I'm Dan Moulthrop of the City Club. I want to also remind you that coming up at the City Club this Friday, Dr. Michael Roizen, the Cleveland Clinic's Chief Wellness Officer and the co-author of all those You books, will be addressing us and probably telling us how to live life a little better. This particular audience, however, might be interested in two upcoming events. Former Comptroller General Dave Walker, who currently heads up the Comeback America initiative, which helps governments deal with fiscal shortfalls, will be addressing us on May 17th. And on May 24th, Eaton Corporation's Sandy Cutler will talk about the campaign to fix the debt. You can, of course, find out more online at cityclub.org. Holding our microphones for the traditional City Club question and answer session, we have Carrie Miller, our program director, and Mike Grimaldi, our development associate. Our first question, right here in the front.
Thank you. Beth Mooney with Key Corp. And thank you for being here today, Secretary Liu. Couldn't agree more about the urgency to expand our economy, bring back growth and jobs. If I could characterize some of what we're hearing from our clients is caution. And when they illuminate the reasons that they feel cautious, one is much of what you talked about today, which is the political uncertainty coming out of Washington around fiscal policy, tax policy, and so forth. If they were here and could characterize that question to you, what would you tell them about how to think about investment and hiring in light of that? Or what would you say would be a catalyst for them to become less cautious and more optimistic to make those decisions?
Nice to see you again. I would start by saying we're in a very different place in terms of the fiscal challenges we face than we were 3 years ago. If anything, we've done too much too fast. And I think the urgency of dealing with our fiscal problems in the medium and the long term is real. But it's not about today and tomorrow. And I would say look at the fundamentals of the economy. Look at a recovery that is showing signs of real strength in manufacturing, in construction, in home ownership, including house values. There are all kinds of signs in the economy that point to the year ending in a stronger place and beginning in a stronger place. This year we saw some drag that we meant to put on the economy in the sense that we had some incentives for growth that were part of our attempt to trigger a recovery, like the payroll tax cut, which couldn't go on forever. At the point in time when the payroll tax went back to its normal level, we knew that that would take a little bit of steam out of the economy. On the other hand, there was a risk if we let it just go on forever, we would not be funding Social Security properly, and we'd become kind of hooked on something that we couldn't do for a permanent policy. That's not going to happen next year. There's no reason looking at the beginning of next year not to see an economy that's growing at a 3+% rate. I mean, I can tell you risks to that. The headwinds in Washington, I think, are controllable. You know, I'll tell you on the debt limit, I've talked to the leaders on both sides over the last few weeks. I can't find anyone who wants to have a showdown. Now, I don't think they figured out a solution yet. I think they understand that it's not something that can be the kind of bargaining chip that it was in 2011, because the mere negotiation over default hurts the economy. If we can get beyond the hurdle of dealing with the debt limit, these other fiscal challenges are more in the line of kind of normal business. Getting rid of the sequester is something that we feel is urgent because it would free up 0.5% growth and it would avoid a lot of unintended pain. But it's going to require compromise. It can't be done just by shifting cuts all to other domestic programs. Now, it's not that expensive to fix compared to a lot of other things, so you could imagine something that wasn't as big as a grand bargain that could deal with that. I haven't given up hope on doing something big enough so we can just put this behind us for a while. I think getting tax reform done would be a real plus. So if we can get a frame, we can get on to the work of tax reform. If we can't get a frame, I think there will be just the normal uncertainty, but it won't be the kind of high-wire uncertainty. I would worry more about the things we don't control, and we're doing everything we can to work around the world to try to reduce those risks. But it's going to be a world where there's some degree of uncertainty, with or without good policy. I would say look at the fundamentals. Within the four corners of the U.S. economy, we're poised for more growth, and we're going to do our level best to make sure that policy supports that.
Hi, I'm Dave Rhines. I'm head of the Workforce Investment Board here in Cleveland, Cuyahoga County. The sequestration cuts for us are going to be 22% effective July 1st. So our budget goes down 22% after 3 years of 10% annual cuts, at a time when employers are looking for employees and job seekers are trying to find jobs. What's the likelihood that the Workforce Investment Act will be reauthorized and that there'll be some funding made available for local workforce investment boards?
Well, I'm not familiar with where the Workforce Investment Act stands right now in terms of reauthorization, but that's a separate question from the effects of sequestration. Sequestration would affect either a continuation of the status quo or a reauthorized program. I can't give you odds. I can tell you that the more questions like that are asked at town meetings over the next few months, the more quickly we're going to see some action taken on sequestration. There is no one who should be pleased with the effects of sequestration. There is every reason to come together for a sensible, balanced plan that would create confidence. So I remain more optimistic than pessimistic, but I can't give you odds.
Another question?
You have a very vintage point of perspective as Secretary of Treasury, as well as past being the working with President Obama. My question is, every analyst that I've seen, they're projecting with domestic oil increase in production, the housing starts going up, as well as the auto industry coming back strong. Projections are 2%, the most I have seen, 1.5% to 2% growth.
For this year?
For this year, and even looking in 2014 and 15, they're saying we don't see that because of Europe and other things that are taking place. How can we get our economy to grow greater than 3% to cut down the deficits and other issues that we have in the economy that would get us going at a faster pace?
Well, we're growing at 2.5% now. The projections I've seen show the end half of the year being stronger than the first half of the year. Obviously, we'll have to see whether that transpires. The causes of fiscal drag that I described going into this year don't get repeated next year. So we start out without slowing down. If the economy is kind of naturally growing at 3.5%, and there's 1.5% of fiscal drag, bringing it down to 2%, next year it won't have that fiscal drag. So I think that we go in next year in a stronger position. I do think that it takes action to back out the effects of sequestration. I certainly hope that we can get that agreed to in a time frame that permits it to be factored into business planning. We shouldn't have to wait until small businesses that are cut off shutter their plants to realize that there was a better alternative. I think that if you look at the kind of core of the U.S. economy, all the indicators are that, kind of X a shock from the outside, there are signs of, steady growth. We can't control for everything on the outside. We can do our very best to manage it. So, I think that if you look at what Europe has done over the last month, they have responded to the argument that you need to balance growth and austerity. They've given more time to countries like Portugal and Ireland and France to meet fiscal targets. That's going to have some effect. The European Central Bank has loosened up on its lending rates. They have to fix their transmission channels to be able to get lending into the hands of small and medium-sized enterprises that will actually be able to get demand moving by hiring people. We can't do that for them. We can participate, as I will this weekend, in meetings with my counterparts and make the case. We have had some success, I think, in urging them in the right direction. We have to do our business here. So if we can deal with the sequestration, if we can manage to avoid self-inflicted wounds over this next year, which I hope we can, I am cautiously optimistic that we'll go into next year in a much better position.
Mr. Secretary, I wish we had more time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a special forum featuring Secretary of the Treasury Jack Lew in conversation with City Club CEO Dan Moulthrop. Secretary Lew, thank you very much. This forum is adjourned.